So welcome to this Monk School event. This is the kind of event, the kind of discussion that we hope is signature of what we do. It is Professor Crenshaw is here on behalf of the Center for the Study of the United States and the Monk School. She will be speaking this evening at a packed event. I hope you have tickets. I will repeat my introduction from last night at dinner. Professor Crenshaw needs no introduction, but this is not about her needs. How do you explain Professor Crenshaw's influence on the world today? It's not easy. One measure, which Professor Crenshaw gets very upset if I mention, is she's more than 3 times as cited as all members of the Monk School faculty combined. And one of the most cited living people. Her impact across all disciplines is exhibited by the fact that 16 departments are co-sponsoring her talk this evening. Her influence is also exhibited by the fact that one of the concepts or the practice she started along with Derek Bell, critical race theory, is now basically illegal in the United States. So that's how you know if you your life's work is made illegal, then under your name, under the very expression that you introduced it, you have influence. And you know it's illegal because it explains what's going on. Now, Professor Crenshaw will have this moderated discussion with Professor Timothy Snyder, who I don't, is a scholar of Eastern Europe, of course, a professor of history at the Monk School, home team here. And I think all of us have been working together, both Professor Snyder and I have worked for the African American Policy Forum, AAPF, which is Professor Crenshaw's institute. I should mention she is, I think, the only person with full tenure at 2 top 10 law schools, Columbia and UCLA. So we've both done activist work for Professor Crenshaw, so Professor Snyder is the author of, I don't even know how to count that many books, but way more than I have, translated into over 40 languages, a scholar of mass killing and authoritarianism. So please welcome Professor Crenshaw to the Monk School. So I'll start out with this question to both of them, because both of you are in your various ways historians. Critical race theory is the practice of looking at practices, legal practices, and other practices that reinforce racial hierarchies that are kept from the past. And Professor Snyder is a historian of authoritarianism and mass killing. So we focus a lot on the present. But what I want to ask you both is, how do we think about the past of the United States in bearing on the present, the way that, and particularly the way that exceptions pose a problem? The United States represented itself as the home of freedom, but Black Americans have never been allowed into that. How does that structure of exceptions play a role in shaping the present?
So first of all, Jason, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be here in Toronto. It feels like a respite, and I don't have to tell you guys why. And it's also a pleasure to be in conversation with you again, Tim. You guys have come to my sandbox to play with me, so it was my turn to come to play with you all. So this is great for me. So I want to take your question and turn it into both how to think about the past and how not to think about the past, because what we're involved in right now is a lesson about how not to think about the past. So as you mentioned, critical race theory has been banned now in several states. In more than 26 states, there are limits in how teachers can teach about the past, and in particular, how they can teach about the racial past. Those limits, those bans are framed in terms of you can't teach something that makes students, and in particular, white students, feel a certain way about the past. This is a very interesting but also not unfamiliar way in which fascists work. The history is about a feeling. It's not about the facts. It's not about usable knowledge about history in order to help us understand the contemporary challenges. Instead, it is a way of framing history as a home team kind of cheer session. This is effectively what has now become the law in too much of the United States. The impact is immeasurable. We now are in a country where nearly 24, 25 million students go to schools in which they are, by law, not permitted to learn the full history. So when authoritarians take over the process of education by dictating the content of what can be told, not only the fact that they are subjecting history to topics, but perspectives on topics. In our field around free speech and freedom of ideas, those are two distinct but deeply problematic areas of concern. What you can substantively talk about and how you can talk about it, what perspective you're trying to pursue. So that's telling us something very clear, very imminent, very dangerous about what's unfolding in the United States today. Now, where I sometimes part with others who are now deeply concerned about the how to think about history is that for us, we've been watching this happen for a while, have been trying to raise alarms for a while, have been saying, what happened to all the academic and free speech concerns when the topic was about anti-racism? Now the topic is to suppress anti-racism, and a lot of those folks have simply disappeared. And I want to say that it's not just in the academic arena that there's been a no-show. We've seen it in traditional civil rights groups who responded to the first wave of suppression, which was against critical race theory, it was against intersectionality, it was against the 1619 Project. The first response was, this is a distraction. This is a trap. We can't simply respond to each of these moments because there's a bigger war to be had, without understanding that this was the Trojan horse of the bigger war, right? So once they tested and figured out what people would permit, they were able to use that template to then apply it more broadly to entire fields of study, to entire campaigns for social, racial, and other forms of justice. So we were that test case, and the test case turned into a positive green light. What's behind that green light? And here's again where I'll get a little more controversial. We have had a fight over the course of, I guess, the last 50 years, not just with the right about how to think about race in American society. We've had a fight with liberals about how to think about race in American society, and we've had a fight with the left about how to do it. And all of this has converged in a particular ambivalence about critical thinking about race. What we found out as one of the points of departure for critical race theory when we were trying to raise the ways of applying critical thinking to race was that some of our allies and colleagues on the left were no more than liberal about race. In other words, they saw race as natural and saw racial hierarchy, I should say, as socially constructed. So their view that race itself was not natural meant that you couldn't create a project, an intellectual project to interrogate it. Liberals, on the other hand, just saw race as something that you could erase by not paying attention to it. And conservatives saw colorblindness as a way of erasing racial justice as an imperative, but falling back on ideas of natural racial hierarchies. So we were having fights with all of them at the same time. That's all metastasized into this moment in what I consider a kind of, okay, we can't talk about that anymore. And over, I think, your concept of anticipatory compliance, they were ready for race to be taken off the table because it was difficult, it was controversial, and there is a sense that we can't win with race being as part of our agendas. And now we see this playing out at the foundation level. We see universities taking out ethnic studies, race studies, and departments as one of the first things to go. So this compliance is, I would say, not necessarily against the will. It's more of a, we might have to finally put this down. That's the consequence of us not making the progress we needed to make on race in the last 50 years that we had the opportunity to do so.
All right, I'm going to stop. Is my mic on? I'm going to stop. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's on? Okay, that's great. I'm going to stop taking notes and start talking then. So I'm going to reconceptualize a little bit of this, but this is in very broad agreement with what Kim has been saying. But from the perspective of someone who's a historian, I'm an American, I'm a historian, I'm not an American historian, right? I had a dear friend called Tony Judd, who was a wonderful historian, who was an American and a Jew, but he was not an American Jew, and like he sort of made this point often, right? So I'm an American, I'm a historian, but I'm not an American historian. So when I think about this problem, I start first in other countries, and then I notice things about the United States which remind me of things I've noticed in other countries. And so for example, where you pick your moment of origin that you define as being neutral and natural. So in the Soviet Union or in Russia now, you pick you pick July of 1941 as a kind of neutral, natural starting point, or June of 1941 rather, June 22nd, as a neutral, natural starting point, because that's when the Germans invaded. And so that's a good place to start history, because that means we didn't do anything wrong. Wrongs were only done to us. But of course, if you start that way, then you're blanking out, you're erasing, in Jason's term, you're erasing the fact that for the previous 2 years you had been an ally of Nazi Germany, which is a very convenient thing to erase. And I imagine you're all nodding, which is very charitable and sweet. But I'm going to say that probably for most people, the notion that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allies for 2 years at the beginning of the Second World War is not that familiar. It's not that intuitive. It's something that's hard to say without a hiccup in a public space, even though I've been saying it for decades now. And so likewise with the U.S. Constitution, right? So there's this notion that if you go back to the beginning, and you say you're an originalist or whatever, that somehow that's a neutral position. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a fresh start. We got rid of the British Empire. We started everything new. What could we possibly have been doing wrong? But an originalist position means that you're uncritically identifying with views of the 1780s, which in general means identifying with the view that people from Africa were inferior in all kinds of ways, and that it was virtually unthinkable that they would be full participants in this project. And so this notion, which is meant to seem neutral, in fact brings with it all kinds of meaningful connotations, which then turn up, right? That's the first thing I wanted to say, is that the problems that we're talking about, we're mostly talking about the US and how the present crisis in the US has historical roots, which one can name and analyze, but this is a world problem. I mean, it's hard to name a country where this doesn't figure in some version. The second thing that I wanted to say is how I think about critical race theory, which is that I see it as essentially like I'm glad Kim's not paying attention because I'm about to say
No,
something.
I'm,
Okay,
I'm
right.
writing everything you say. I'm taking my notes
Oh,
too.
damn. Okay. So, like, I see critical race theory as essentially very sound historical method because critical race theory is about, again, correct me, but it's about not taking literally the things that are said. It's about it's about taking law seriously but not literally, and by extension, taking other things seriously but not literally. So just because you have laws about civil rights doesn't mean that the whole society has taken a turn, right? It may even mean that other things are happening at the same time in the exact opposite direction. And that is, of course, what historians try to do. We don't go back and read primary sources and say, oh, this is literally true, and somehow this other primary source which says something else is also literally true, and this third primary source which contradicts those two is also literally true. That's not what we do. We try to figure out, and this is very old-fashioned, I'm basically paraphrasing von Ranke, but we try to figure out what was actually going on. And what is actually going on is something which is hidden in the interstices of all the sources, which always requires a certain amount of interpretation and intervention, right? And the more sources you have, the better. But what's really going on is never what the law actually says. And it's never what anyone actually says in a bit of correspondence. And so critical race theory for me is like it's sound historical method. It's like you're turning over the earth, you're turning over the earth, you're turning over the earth until you start to see what's actually happening. And then my third point is about the purpose of history. And I think here I'm going to be saying things which are quite similar to what Professor Crenshaw said. I think history is necessary for empathy. Because if you just say that history is what makes you feel okay in your own skin, then you feel okay in your own skin. But you don't have any idea what it's like to be inside somebody else's skin. And history is not about what it's like to be inside their skin either. History is something where it kind of touches on everybody, but it doesn't make anybody feel completely good, right? And if you know things about history, like a good history book will always make you feel uncomfortable, no matter who you are. Like if you turn the last page of a history book and you're like, I feel wonderful now. That wasn't a good history book, and it probably wasn't a history book at all, honestly. Whereas when you learn history, like you're a little bit startled, you're a little bit unsettled, and you look around and you recognize the experiences of other people a little bit more than you did before, right? So you need history for empathy, and relatedly for maturation. Like honestly, it makes me sick as an American to imagine kids going through our school systems not being able to break away from the things that their parents tell them, right? Or not being able to break away from the things that make sense to them at their age, right? Maturing involves recognizing that there are perspectives that go beyond your own experience, your family's experience, your church's experience, right? That's what maturation means. It means not getting stuck. It means breaking out. And history helps you to break out, because it helps you to see that there are other kinds of truths, right? Like it's not that your own experience lies or your parents lie or your church lies. It's that there are more kinds of, maybe they do, of course, right? But it's that there are other kinds of truths out there, and that you keep going, you get touched by those other kinds of truth. And then relevant to that is the possibility, and I'm moving a tiny bit towards politics, is the possibility of coalitions. So you can't really do democratic politics you can't do pluralism without coalitions. And you can't do coalitions without some level of mutual understanding, which doesn't necessarily mean identifying, right? It doesn't mean that I am in the same identity group as somebody else, but I can understand them enough to make a coalition. And history really helps with that. History clears away, like it breaks some of the ice at the beginning of the conversation if you already have the history. Because it means that in order to form a coalition, you don't have to start at point A and then like explain every single thing. Some of the stuff is already held in common, right? And then related to that, and I'm going to hit on a point that I think Kim was making as well, and we'll see if it's the same point. But I'm not a messenger, right? Like, sorry, that sounded religious. I meant in the political sense. Like, I'm not a polling person. Like, I'm not a messenger. What do they call it? Messengering. Like, I'm not big into messaging. Like, it's a term that I really don't like. And it's a term like messaging and polling, like these are the terms that basically overwhelm the daily political conversation. And I don't message, like I just kind of say what I think. I have that luxury, to be able to say what I think as a tenured professor, and as a, basically like autistic human being who doesn't mind that much what other people think. Hey, it's not good when only my spouse laughs at that joke. That's like doubly bad. First of all, that was funny, y'all, and like, and secondly, wait a minute. Okay, but the point here is that as I with part of my, as out of the corner of my eye, I follow the democratic conversation about messaging. It seems to be moving in the direction of, well, wait a minute, actually maybe messaging itself wasn't such a great idea, because messaging can become like a form of, as you say, anticipatory obedience. And when you're messaging, you're always making compromises with things, and you're never actually like hitting that nail on the head, right? You're never hitting that nail on the head with your forehead, which sometimes you have to do. Like sometimes you got to lean out and take the pain. And with race is one of those things. And when I think about like the inherent radicalism and wildness of American politics right now, I tend to think that people prefer for you to tell them what you really think, even if they disagree with you, than to hear you middle and maddle and muddle the whole time. That's my take. And if that's right, then it's better to just go whole hog on racial issues and say what you think and talk about the history than it is to try to make all kinds of compromises all the time. I mean, it's right morally, but what I'm trying to suggest is that it might also be right politically. Okay, I've got some other stuff to say, but I'm going to pause there because I want to hear Jason's next question.
So I'm glad you talked about the U.S. Constitution and its role in our memory politics, and because that does lead to my next question. So one of the 19th century debates between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass was about the Constitution and the role of the Constitution. I'm going to use this to ask about ideals and hopes in the light of America's brutal history. What Douglass urged against William Lloyd Garrison's claim that the Constitution was a slavery document was that we should reclaim the Constitution. We should reclaim the Constitution for American ideals. And you see this throughout the history of Black organizing and Black activism, this reclamation of American ideals, this reminding people about that they're being hypocritical to these American ideals. Now, how do we negotiate this? How do we negotiate the ideals, the reminding people of the ideals, when America has become a kind of, has lived up to the Soviet Union's correct description of the United States as a white supremacist nation? Now we are a white supremacist. We were always a white supremacist nation, but now we're kind of officially a white supremacist nation. So how do we recover the ideals? How do we use the ideals while not forgetting that the United States has the fourth highest incarceration rate in the world, that we incarcerate our formerly enslaved population to levels that are world historically evil, that Tim and I teach a class, Mass Incarceration in the United States and the Soviet Union, where looking at mass incarceration societies. So how do we deal with the reality of history while following, or should we follow, that honored path of looking to a better future?
You want to start that one, Tim?
If you like.
Sure.
I mean, I probably don't have as much to say, nearly as much to say about this as you do. But I take that question as a question about the possibility of the future of the American Republic, because I think the existence of the American Republic is very much in question now. I think that's the real ground issue of politics. It's not about, for me, whether Trump succeeds in installing some kind of thoroughgoing fascist dictatorship from California to Connecticut. I think that outcome is unlikely, because I think everything breaks first, or pieces start to fall off before you get to that outcome. I'm not saying that's not what he's trying to do. I mean, I've been saying that's what he's been trying to do for some time, and I'm not changing that story. But I think it's more likely that the system cracks under the pressure of this attempt. And so I want to frame the discussion, at least my part of it, that way, because I don't honestly see how the Republic goes forward without the Constitution, right? So as a practical matter, I can imagine parts of the U.S. slipping out from under the Constitution now. The president is seeking to himself personally to slip out from the bounds of the Constitution. Kim will have more to say about this, but the Supreme Court seems to be very confused about its role in I mean, not just that interpretations are mistaken or not, but they seem to be confused about their actual role in all of this in a fairly profound way. So the second point would be something like, yeah, taking as given all the critiques of the Constitution, historical and otherwise, I think the question is about the Republic, and practically, if the Constitution breaks, that's because the Republic is breaking. So, I mean, but to give you my take about this, I'm essentially on the Frederick Douglass side. Like, I think that there are animating principles within the Constitution which, properly interpreted, so rule of law, balance of powers, the notion of liberty, that there are things in the Constitution which, if differently interpreted, could lead to a just society. So I'm kind of two minds here. Like, on the one hand, I think you can't make I'll try to reconcile the apparent contradiction. You can't interpret the Constitution in a way which allows for the flourishing of Americans without recognizing its historical situation, right? And it's precisely by way of seeing where the Constitution arose and whom it was meant to empower and disempower. It's by way of that you could think your way forward to an improvement, which would involve an amendment as well as reinterpretation. So if the Republic's going to exist, I think it has to be something like that you need the history in order to criticize the Constitution, but the criticism of the Constitution has to lead to amendment and reinterpretation, something like that. I want to hear what Kim has to say, though.
So that's obviously been the tension for any of us who have been engaged in the practice of constitutional scholarship with an eye towards transformative possibilities. We have always had to deal with the fact that the Constitution was, in fact, a slave document. The Republic was, in fact, a republic grounded on theft of labor and land and reproductive capacity of black women. That's one thing that never gets talked about that must be inserted in our reflection. And even if it is the case that there are ultimate limitations for how far we can go towards creating the conditions of a real democracy within the constraints of the Constitution, we haven't come anywhere close to it. So it is, as an initial matter, an easy answer to simply say, let's actually try to use the Constitution to do its maximal amount. In fact, we've tried that a few times, and it is true that the Constitution can be interpreted in a way that does far, 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 far more than it's doing right now. So that raises a question of whether we're dealing with an inherent structural limitation that's embodied in that document, or are we dealing with a set of practices that consistently undermine the possibilities that are inherent within? The way I think about it sometimes, it's a question of whether we're going to look at how far the rubber band can stretch or how quickly it snaps back. Because the stretch is what happened in the Reconstruction Constitution, the remaking of the very relationship between the state and the national government, the remaking of the relationship between government and its citizens. When African Americans were given citizenship, they were also given a new protector of that citizenship. The national government, Congress, became the guarantor of citizenship. That was a fundamental rewriting and rethinking of how citizenship should be thought about in the United States, which was essentially initially through the states, which allowed Southern governments to limit the concept of citizenship in order to reinforce slavery as a status that was inherited by people of African descent. So that was a flip, and it was an important flip that happened. It was the product of the Civil War. It was the spoils of the defeat of the South, and it could have been the basis for Douglas's affirmation. Like no document always remains what it was intended to be at the first place. It undermines our sense of human agency. So we can actually remake things. The problem is, what do we make of the fact that those things that were remade were so quickly overturned, so quickly, snapped back? So, Ta-Nehisi Coates calls his book 8 Years in Power. He wasn't referring to Obama. He was referring to Reconstruction. We were 8 years in power. What happened in those 8 years? What happened in those 8 years was a vision of a multiracial society that we have not really been able to resuscitate since. What happened in those 8 years was a proliferation of certain ideas about how education should be made widely available as a condition of democracy. What happened in those 8 years were different ideas about work, different ideas about community. Unfortunately, not different ideas about gender. So there's always going to be a limitation that we have to grapple with. But there was a possibility that was quickly, violently suppressed. And that violent suppression was articulated in the language of neutrality. It was articulated at the constitutional level in amendments to the Constitution and other laws that intentionally and directly had the effect of disenfranchising the new citizens and returning them to a position of powerlessness and in some ways available for exploitation that was more life-threatening than some of the conditions that pre-existed the end of slavery. I'm talking about convict labor and things that I know you all know about. So what do we make? What is the story that we tell ourselves about the overthrow of that possibility? Is the limit in the document, or is it the limit in us? Is it the way that whiteness was able to galvanize mass consent over and against what the Constitution made possible as the condition and scope of democracy? I would say, as long as that possibility, the snapback, is made possible because of white consciousness, because of the idea that I would rather live in a broken democracy than share it with you, which was additionally what we saw again on January 6th. That was the long arc of that sensibility that keeps generating the same kind of destructive sentiments in society. As long as that's still there, we will never really know what the Constitution itself is capable of.
Can I have another crack at that one? Yeah, this is inspiring a few thoughts. One thing I want to say is that this issue of, it's not unique to the Constitution, right? So like insofar as all of you Canadians are zoning out as we go into like this American dispute about the late 18th century, there's a broader issue here, which is that democracy has always been like this. Republics have always been like this. The history of democracy and the history of republics is not a history of everyone having equal participation. The history of democracy and the history of republics is the history of there being a group which is larger than oligarchs who have special rights, including to vote, right? And then the big shift is, and again, this is America not being exceptional, the big shift is how you get from it being a select group of people who have the right to vote and also the right to colonize. Those two things seem to go together. How do you get that group to become everybody? And so in the United States, there's a specific story about race, there's a specific story about the native population, there's a specific story about women, but there's a general arch here, which is that things that are called democracies and republics historically start out with it being a small group, and then how do you get from the small group to everyone? And that notion that it should be everyone is not a new one, right? Jefferson speaks as though it was everyone, although he was a slave owner, right? Kant speaks as though it should be everyone, although he had very specific ideas about who a human being, in fact, was, right? And so all of even the universalisms are themselves. You find your favorite universalist thinker, and then it turns out that he or she made exceptions. But this is a general problem, and I would much as I'm concerned about the U.S. example, I would phrase it that way. Agreeing with exactly what Kim said about whiteness, there is an issue here about how you get beyond imperial politics in general. Because democracies and republics historically have also been empires. The French have a very good way of tricking us. The French say, well, we were a republic, then we were an empire, then we were a republic, then we were an empire. But even when they were republics, they were also empires, right? France never stopped being an empire just because it was like the première or the deuxième or the troisième or whatever. That doesn't stop them being an empire. They were always an empire, right? And the fact that America is a republic doesn't stop it from being an empire. And so for me, the very broad question is, how do you get to a form of post-imperial politics which involves the beneficiaries of various imperial practices, be they white Americans or be they some other group, coming to terms with history and making some kind of conscious decision about it? Because this is the second thing I was thinking about. The progress doesn't happen on its own, right? And one of the things that leads to the snapbacks is the notion that progress is happening on its own. The notion that all in all, we're moving in a certain direction. As soon as you start thinking that, we are moving in a certain direction, or the country is moving in a certain direction, or history has a certain direction, you're just inviting that snapback, right? Because that's never how it works. It always works that there's some kind of struggle, and that struggle creates different epistemic conditions for those who are inside the struggle, but also for the people who are adjacent to the struggle and are some way affected by the struggle. And so this just leads me to the last thought that I want to share, which is that it has to do with how you interpret the Constitution. And Frederick Douglass spoke about this famously, but do you think about that moment as a moment where people were struggling to get beyond themselves, even if they didn't get where you wanted them to go, right? But they were struggling to get beyond themselves where they were. And if that's true, then that means you have to struggle to get beyond yourself where you are now, right? And so then the interpretation of the 18th century in the United States would be, okay, all of the flaws, everything, but this group, nevertheless, in some way was struggling to get beyond where they were. And that means the correct interpretation of that moment is you struggle to get beyond where you are now, right? Because they would never have said, okay, what we're fighting for in our Revolutionary War and what we're trying to draw up in our Constitution is trying to go back 250 years, right? None of them ever said anything like that. And so when we say, hey, it's time to go back 250 years, we may be violating the spirit of that moment, right? And so this is one way of thinking about the Constitution, that people were trying to jump over their own shadows. They may have jumped over one or two shadows and there were many shadows left, but the correct interpretation would then be, okay, let's ourselves try to jump over one or two shadows.
So let me add something.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat a comment and also a way of a question, because I am not an international scholar on these questions. So I'm curious about a few dimensions of the American obsession with its heroes, hero worshiping, whether that is also a condition in other republics or not. So two points of departure. So we're about to, and I hope that it's not going to travel here. We're about to go into a 250th birthday celebration in the United States. Perfectly timed to finish the project of erasing all of the dimensions of recovery about the conditions of the birth of the nation. The framing has been America was born perfect and just kept getting better. So we're going to have a lot more of that over the course of the next couple of months. What that brings to mind is both how participating in the project of constitutional lawmaking seems to require signing on to this idea like it's a religion, an article of faith. The Supreme Court justices are framed as the high priests, and they are supposed to maintain fidelity to the word of the on high. And so that is a sort of a practical reality, but it also gets absorbed into the culture more broadly. And I just don't know if that's exceptional or not. So at the 200th anniversary, Thurgood Marshall, who was the first black Supreme Court justice, wrote an article that almost got him impeached. And in this article, he basically said, all this flag waving and celebration about this great miracle of Philadelphia, acting as though the Constitution is the best thing since sliced bread, it wasn't that great from the beginning, and it was so flawed that it led to a cataclysmic civil war and had to be rebuilt from bottom up. So I don't think it was all that great. I'm not going to jump up and down. I'm not going to be waving any flag. What I'm going to be doing is remembering, commemorating, and celebrating all of the blood, all of the sweat, all of the lives that were lost to create the notion of America that people take as their birthright. It was not a birthright. It was hard fought and won. So, because he wrote that, the ancestors of MAGA basically said he is not qualified to serve on the Supreme Court. We need to begin impeachment proceedings. Now, fortunately, that was in 1976. Had it been this year, the impeachment proceedings probably would have actually happened. That's how far we've come in this idea of you've got to not only celebrate the Constitution, but you've got to celebrate the original vision of the Constitution, which would be such a contradiction for a black person to get into, but that's another issue. It would be one thing if this was just a preoccupation of those of us who drank the Kool-Aid. But our entire society is enmeshed in this. So I'll end with this. I teach a course called Race Representation in the Law. It is a way to teach a film course in a law school. And what we do is we look at how race, the state, law are imagined in film, in cinema, because more people have access to that than any case they'll ever read in their entire lives, or any law, or the Constitution itself. So one of the first movies we look at is a movie called Amistad, and it's like a complicated thing. It's a Steven Spielberg movie, and it's basically at the core of it was the question of whether Africans who were captured off the coast of the Atlantic are enslaved people, or whether they are contraband that are owned by someone else, or whether they can be freed and go back. And so the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in this fantastic scene, Anthony Hopkins is pleading the Supreme Court to let the Africans go. And in it, he has this whole stretch where it's all about honoring the vision of the ancestors and taking the courage to ask them what should be done. So in this speech, and it's Steven Spielberg at his best. The wind is flowing. All of the Africans are now dressed in, Victorian wear. They'd been in rags the whole time. They're sitting there earnestly, wanting their freedom. And he's going through the bus of American presidents, starting with George Washington, and then moving to Thomas Jefferson. These are two of the wealthiest presidents who held the most slaves, asking them for their wisdom to let these potentially enslaved people go. And even though we in that class fully know that this is a contradiction on top of a contradiction, no way in the world you can appeal to Washington and Jefferson to let the people free. It still works because something is there in the American psyche before the facts. And so people love that scene, and when it's over, it's like, yes, let the people go. We're like, do you realize what you have just done? You have shown the power of the idea of hero worship, the idea that who our founders are much more important than what they actually did. The facts don't matter. The worship is what matters. It drives me crazy. And I don't know if it's just an American sickness or it's broader.
Well, so I think I want to end the last 10 minutes. One thing that Canadians always say is like American imperialism telling us your situation. Very few people here are in fact American. And so I wanted to switch to some, your work is read all over the world. The concepts that you focus on, and here at the Monk School, I take it we were hired here to stop the sickness of America coming over here. And that is a really,
That's interesting.
really, and to address, I've been told that Canada does not have a cult of founders, and that isn't a part of society. Well, I mean,
So I'm seeing this.
right.
I'm
mean,
seeing
George
this.
Washington. I've never heard. You guys have heard of George Washington? You know, it's really strong. You know, in the United States, as Professor Crenshaw says, it's not like you were. You know. Do you worship your founders as religious figures? So.
We had like everywhere, like we went to Queen's University and he was like, there were pubs named after him. There's been
Do you,
They had a statue in Queen's Park just there. It was covered up for a couple of years, and they just reopened it in celebration of John A. Macdonald's farm.
right? People have. I mean, yeah.
Museums are critical of him now.
Right.
His house has a whole
Yeah.
display of what he did wrong.
I mean, one thing. Yeah, I think you need to be.
Yeah.
We need someone with experience in both worlds to
Compare them.
compare the situations. But I want to talk about the concept of multiracial democracy and why democracy has to be multiracial, as you so often say. Canada deals with these notions where we have here, Passant Matter was telling me at CBC, they were saying, you have to think of yourself as talking to Susie from Saskatchewan. That would be a white person, I'm given to understand. But Toronto is minority white. You know, it's the most diverse city in the world. So we have these struggles here, and we have xenophobia here. We have these we're in a xenophobic moment here in Canada. That's inherited. That's a fact, not inherited, but that's the precursor to fascism. So could you say, I also want to talk about patriarchy, because I hear that exists in Canada too. So I wanted to ask about, but I wanted you to say something about the importance of multiracial democracy in the most diverse city in the world.
Well, I guess obviously multiracial democracy has to be multiracial in a society that is multiracial. Otherwise, it's not truly democracy. I think we all kind of lean into that. I think the many questions are why it has been so difficult to sustain in countries that have very different histories. And so it raises, I guess, a question, and I'm also not in this discipline. Is there something inherent about the idea of difference, the distinctions that we draw between us and them? Is that learned, or is that somehow more deeply rooted, and then do structures get built on top of those instincts? I don't have an answer to that. I don't know the answer to it. I know I'm surprised at how quickly us-them politics can emerge with very slight pressure. So it does seem to suggest that there may be something that is more, I don't want to go to the transhistorical point, because I don't think anything is transhistorical, but it's definitely a transnational phenomenon. Now, it may have different expressions and more deeply connected to the very notion of who we are. So I think actually it makes a difference whether we hero worship, and in that hero worship there is an essential idea of who the us is that we can continuously attach ourselves to. So anyone who's not that is likely to be another. And we can have situations like in our country where the Supreme Court once declared that certain groups can never, ever, no matter what, be citizens not because of who they are, but because now who they are has been interpreted by what we have done to them. So their inherent identity is a product of what was done to them. When that becomes part of the operating system, it seems to be really, really hard to get that out, whether we call it a virus or whether we call it a bug that is intended to be that way. Once it's there, the aspiration is going to be an ongoing one. It's not like, as Timothy was saying earlier, it's not as though it's a natural forward and we're always moving forward. It's always going to be a fundamental tension in society. And so those who think that we will eventually get over it in the by and by, so we need to act as if we're already there, as opposed to these are the conditions that require us to be conscious of all of the ways that exclusions have been rationalized to undermine our multiracial democracy. As long as this other possibility is there, it seems like it's always going to be an ebb and flow, not between a multiracial democracy and its denial, but between the actual moral imperative for it. We've lost the moral imperative. And that means the possibility of actually continuing to struggle for it is now under renewed pressure, not just from conservatives, but I think from a lot of other segments in our society.
I think, Jason, there's a way to address your question, which picks up on the question that Kim was asking me. So I think it is unusual to hero worship in the way that we do hero worship people who have been dead for so long, right? Exactly. It's a long time ago. I think that is unusual, and I think it's always been dangerous. So for one thing, as you already suggested, if you hero worship the founding fathers, then the notion is that Americans are people who look like founding fathers, right? Maybe without different clothing, maybe without the wigs, but essentially it's middle-aged white guys. Mm-hmm. And then from there, you get to the notion that, okay, maybe I don't get to be as rich as Jefferson or Washington. Maybe I'm not the guy who would have owned a bunch of slaves, but I can at least police the boundaries of the America that they made, right? And this is a bit the Southern history, that the system benefits some people a lot, and then there are white folks who are not really economically benefited by it, but they police the political boundaries of it because of the sense of racial self-assurance that comes from it, right? And so the founding fathers enable a certain definition of Americanness, which has the consequence that you get white folks doing the labor of keeping other people out of the system. The second problem with it, and to be straightforward about this, is that it's essentially fascist.
Right.
I mean, the notion that your country exists because of some great people whose faces you literally put on a mountain, right, is in fact a fascist idea. It's a fascist idea.
It's right out of Mein Kampf. Hitler says we've forgotten the art of education, which is to propose the great men of the nation as the center of the education.
Yeah. So if the thing is it's in tension with the Constitution, right? Because the Constitution is a document which you can read in different ways. As Kim already said, you're always reading it a different way. You can't read it the same way. It's literally impossible to say I'm reading the Constitution in exactly the same way as somebody read it 250 years ago or close. It's just impossible. But once you say it's about the great men, then you're free of interpreting the Constitution, right? Because you're in more like a biblical prophet mode, with apologies to all you monotheists out there, where like the latest biblical prophet can just say like it means something completely different, right? And so you then put new people on Mount Rushmore. So when Trump thinks of himself as being on Mount Rushmore, what that partly means is I get to completely reinterpret this whole tradition because I'm the latest great man, or I'm a founding father, essentially. And so the founding father thing, if you push it to its logical extreme, leads to constitutional nihilism. And it leads to a situation which we have in 2026, if I'm not mistaken, where like we're putting the actual documents on planes and we're flying them around as though they were sacred objects, right? It's not the text or the meaning or the interpretation or the tradition or the present day contestation or the moral possibility of these documents. It's the physical document. We're putting it on a plane and we're flying it around so people can worship it. It doesn't mean anything. It means exactly what the latest founding father tells you it means, right? I think that's what's special about us.
Right. Jack Balkin said, America is special because the mythic past is the Constitution, and so it plays this. Yeah. I mean, Hitler does say in Mein Kampf that the education system must be based on the great men of the race who founded the nation and their great activities, so that people are proud of the nation and race. So it is straightforwardly fascist.
And of course, straightforwardly fascist and explicitly recommended. So one of the things that Trump did was purge the Naval Academy of books that he considered to be improper ideology. And so you can tell a lot in what was taken off the shelf, but even more in terms of what was left on the shelves. So Maya Angelou taken off the shelf. Of course, Malcolm X taken off the shelf. How Racism Works taken off the shelf. What's left on the shelf? Mein Kampf.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's left on the shelf? The bell curve,
Yeah.
asserting the natural hierarchy of intelligence based on race. So this improper ideology is everything that is not white, father, worship, along with its patriarchal dimensions. We don't have to dig it out anymore. It
Right,
is
it's surface.
there. It's served up, almost with a dare
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
anything about it.
Yeah, the Trump said there was a sort of shocking moment in his, I think it was Davos, I'm not sure, where he said recently, Somalians are low IQ, but they're good at crime. And he said that in an international stage. And it wasn't covered on the front page of the New York Times, but
Yes.
when I was looking at other newspapers, I was looking at African journalists, and they were just like, wow, the level of explicitness.
And so let's think about this. What has happened so that explicit racism, explicit anti-black racism, is no longer newsworthy
Yeah.
in the conventional, papers? What has happened?
Right, it couldn't be more, the white supremacy of the United States could not be more explicit, and so fighting it by saying it's white supremacy does not help.
It doesn't help at this point. And I'll end with this. Langston Hughes always is quoted for the idea, you don't have to tell the Negro what fascism is, we know, right? But the challenge has been the separation between the white supremacist project and understanding fascism. So yes, people probably are aware of the function of white supremacy, but there's very little intersection in the way this gets talked about. So that is over here somewhere, more as a project of white supremacy. In other words, yeah, that's what we do, or that's what has been done, to racialized others, and in particular with respect to sort of the biological inability for a certain defined group to ever be seen as just human. That is really a focal point of anti-blackness in American society. Yet the conversation hasn't seen that as being relevant to the study and understanding of the facilitation of American fascism. And I would say that, it's a continuing weakness in our conceptualization, and we see it with the ho-hum sort of response to things that are clearly, rabidly racist in American society.
Can I add one thing before we're done? Yeah. So there's an interesting dialectical flip which happens here, and that is this: the whole time, the white supremacist position, at least in my country, has been we are very reasonable. We are very smart. We are very reasonable. And you folks are very emotional, right? Like you just react to everything, right? You know, you can't be trusted. You don't really think. That's been the whole move the whole time. We preserve the Enlightenment tradition, like we preserve the Constitution because we are reasonable people, and the rest of you just have emotional reactions, which we have to be patient about. Right? That's basically the shtick. Okay. Now, notice how our whole conversation goes in the other direction. The whole conversation is about how if you want to be seriously analytic by way of critical race theory or some other method, but if you want to be seriously analytic about US history or imperial history, you have to precisely start from the point of view of the non-white, non-male folks, right? That any serious analysis actually begins with that empirical data. And that if you want to do a serious analysis about what's going wrong in the US right now, you got to do the same thing. Whether you use history or not, I'd recommend you use history, but you got to do the same thing. Because if you start from the utterances of the white guys who are at the top right now, it's just bleeding, okay, right? It's essentially just, like there is no, like if you consider, just to take as an example, Mr. Trump's various rationales for the war in Iran, or his various rationales for anything, there is no principle of non-contradiction at play, right? There is no effort to use words to mirror the world, right? There's no evidence of any form of what one might define as rationality. It's all just not there, and so everything has flipped, right? So you can being the white supremacist, in fact, is permission to be completely irrational all the time. And I say this because I think there's another element at play here, which is the way that the overall communication space has changed, such that you can get away with not pretending anymore that you're the rational ones. And I think that has a lot to do with something which is another subject, right? Which is not in contradiction with this. It just has hastened this process that we're talking about, which is the shortening of attention spans, the way that oligarchy and wealth concentration has changed media so that certain people get attention without deserving it at all. Like you get attention without having to fight for it. You don't have to make your case because the spotlight is already on you, right? And then you can just do whatever you want. And that, I think, has overlapped with the American history we've been talking about.
All right, so that is our conclusion. Let's thank Professor Crenshaw for